In 1982, an insurance salesman named Tom Clancy began writing a book. Titled The Hunt for Red October, the book was a national bestseller. Over 2 million paperback covers were sold, partially due to, at the time, President Ronald Reagan's praise of the story, calling it the best yarn. It would later be adapted into a 1990 film titled the same name, directed by John McTiernan, who also directed the Predator movie, starring Sean Connery, Alec Baldwin, James Earl Jones, Sam Neill, Tim Curry, Stellan Skarsgård, and others. To give a very, very brief summary, Clancy's story follows a Soviet submarine captain named Marco Ramius, portrayed by Connery in the film, who, after being given command of a top-secret advanced submarine that can be undetectable by sonar, goes rogue. A CIA analyst and former Marine named Jack Ryan, played by Baldwin, briefs the U.S. government about the danger of the Red October presents. The name of Ramius' submarine poses in terms of being able to launch nuclear weapons very close to shore. He is later dispatched to aid both the American and Soviet governments to locate the vessel, but Ryan believes that Ramius is attempting to defect, and this turns out to be the case. After boarding the submarine, Ramius and Ryan work together to get the ship to America, and they succeed at the end of the movie. Spoilers for a very old movie. The story is a tense military spy thriller. While the events of the story are fictional, it was inspired in part by true events. Also in 1982, before Clancy began writing it, a former Marine officer named Gregory D. Young, for his master's thesis, investigated a mutiny in the Soviet Union. Mutiny on Storozhevoy, a case study of dissent in the Soviet Navy, was placed in the United States Naval Academy archives, where Clancy would later find it, read it, and use it as the basis for his story. However, the story of the Storozhevoy and the story of the Red October are quite different. The tale of the mutiny and its orchestrator is a fascinating, inspiring, and deeply important story to learn, especially for us who call ourselves revolutionary socialists. To quote the central figure of this story himself, "I address myself to those of you who take our revolutionary past to their hearts, to those who can think critically but not cynically about our present and the future of our people." This is the main character of the true story that inspired The Hunt for Red October, Valery Sablin. So who the heck is this guy? Valery Mikhailovich Sablin was born on January 1st, 1939 in Leningrad in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. In 1975, he attempted to ignite a revolution that would overthrow the Stalinist government and reestablish a Leninist Soviet democracy. Though he failed in the attempt, there's still a lot that it can be learned from him in terms of his fierce revolutionary optimism. So let's set the scene. After the end of the Second World War, the USSR was, to put it lightly, not a very good place to live in. We have to remember by this point, Lenin was dead and the state that he had helped to build was slowly being eroded. Joseph Stalin's regime was really the main driving force, but Nikita Khrushchev and Leonid Brezhnev's times were barely any better. Forced collectivization was causing mass starvation. The USSR was trying to beat the US in a suicidal arms race. The KGB was vicious in their attempts to stomp out perceived threats, and so on and so forth. The government was full of corrupt bureaucrats and Stalinist hypocrites who claimed to represent the will of the people, but very much cared only about themselves. The very dissent that the USSR was founded on was being suppressed, with the Novocherkassk massacre being a prime example of this. Even worse, racism, xenophobia, anti-Semitism, and homophobia, and general inequality were very much alive and well under the regimes of these times. It's fairly safe to say that when Brezhnev's entire time in office is collectively labeled as the era of stagnation, things were massively shitty and not getting better. It is in these tumultuous times that our protagonist, Sablin, grew up in. As mentioned before, Sablin was born on the 1st of January 1939 in Leningrad. His father and grandfather both had long careers serving in the Navy of Russia, and he spent his childhood on several naval bases. He practically grew up on the sea on a ship, and was accepted into the Frunze Military Academy in Leningrad to learn how to be a naval officer. Sablin was also a fiercely honest and moral person who hated hypocrisy, injustice, and general assholery. His brother, Boris Sablin, said he was incapable of lying. Sablin was a star student, read the works of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and was a model communist. not a Stalinist, a Leninist. His entire class seemed to know that he was different from most others, and they were all aware of the rotting carcass that the USSR was. One of Sablin's classmates recalled, "We were all educated to believe in socialist and communist ethics. We all believed in them. But Valery had such integrity, he wanted to put those ideals in action." To put it simply, Sablin began to recognize that while the Soviet Union wore the colors of communism and used its icons, it was not at all a communist state in its actions, and that gave him pause. And thus, his disillusionment began. Sablin saw the writing on the wall. The USSR was not even close to the worker state that Lenin and the October Revolution established. At the age of 20, very dissatisfied with the turn of affairs, Sablin wrote a letter to Nikita Khrushchev himself denouncing the state of the Union and demanded that Khrushchev remove the corrupt bureaucrats and save the Soviet Union. This was quite the move and went about as well as you can expect. He was severely reprimanded, with his graduation being delayed, but nevertheless, he did end up graduating with honors, no less, and spent a significant amount of time going from ship to ship and eventually marrying a woman who he would have a son with. Eventually, he was offered to be the commander of a naval destroyer. By this time, he was 30, which is insane that this career progression, like, holy cow. But he declined this offer, however, and instead enrolled in the Lenin Military Political Academy to become a naval political officer, to become an agent of the KGB. Sablin wanted to understand why the USSR had turned out the way it did and how the system worked from the inside, a move which kind of stunned his wife and family at the time. But that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to find out why things had turned out the way they did and what he could do, what he could learn from the inside of the system. And something extremely important to know, that during his time at the academy, he attempted to read the writings of Trotsky, but those were off limits, which only reinforced Sablin's belief that the USSR, that the communism, quote unquote, of the USSR under Stalin, Khrushchev, and Brezhnev was not the revolutionary workers' democracy they claimed to be, but an oligarchic, bureaucratic monster of a state that crushed everything under its heel. Sablin knew that this was not the way things should be, but he did not give in to despair. He vowed silently that he was going to do what he could to restore the Soviet Union to what it was under Lenin. And if that meant bringing the entire dented, decaying hull of this sinking ship down and rebuilding it from the bottom up, then that is what he was going to do. And that's exactly what he attempted to do with his mutiny. In 1973, after he graduated, he was assigned to a Burevestnik class anti-submarine frigate called the Starostovoy, which translates roughly to sentry, though it also could be translated as guardian or vigilant, a very fitting name. He was the political officer on board the ship, second in command to only the captain himself and the hand of the KGB on the ship. With his authority, he began to slowly breed dissent among the crew, building up support with revolutionary Leninist rhetoric instead of the usual political officer stick that the Kremlin was spewing out at the time. This went on for 2 whole years until the time finally came. To quote Sablin himself once more from the last entry of his log, quote, "Sometimes you have to wait almost half your life for your one moment to come." On November 5th, 1975, the Sentry arrived in the Baltic port city of Riga to take part in a military ceremony commemorating the anniversary of the October Revolution. It was at this moment, a perfect moment, that Sablin acted. He pulled a comrade and confidant of his named Alexander Shine, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, aside to lay out his whole plan. And it was simple but complicated. They would seize control of the ship and sail it to Leningrad, where Sablin would get on the public radio and broadcast a message calling for the people of the USSR to rise up and revolt against the so-called communists in Moscow. And the thing is, this call to arms very well could have succeeded. Most everyone in the Soviet Union was not happy with the way things were, just like Sablin, and yearned for change. During the mutiny itself, some of the soldiers who were ordered to attack the Sentry did not do so once they heard the Sentry say they were not traitors and what they were trying to do. If Sablin had made it to Leningrad uninterrupted, who knows what the world could look like today? And it's very clear that he wanted a socialism from below revolution made up of the people. His motive was altruistic, optimistic, and deeply socialist. In a letter to his wife, he wrote and sent before the attempt, he said, quote, "Why am I doing this? The love of life. I mean, not in the sense of the comfortable bourgeoisie, but a bright, truthful life which inspires a genuine joy in all honest people." During the ceremony, Sablin locked the captain in a room and gathered the crew. He played the movie Battleship Potemkin in order to set the mood and inspire his men, and then he laid out his plan in full. Many people were confused, but quite a few were persuaded and joined Sablin after a vote was held. Those who didn't were locked up as well. The mutiny was in full swing by this point. The Century left Riga and tore towards Leningrad. The mood was high, no one was stopping them, but unfortunately, one of the crewmen who refused to take part in the mutiny managed to free himself and escape, and reported to the Kremlin that Sablin was a traitor and was basically revolting against the Soviet Union. The Kremlin got news of the mutiny, and they freaked the fuck out. Reactions were very slow at first due to the celebration having just finished by this point, and people were still very much hungover and, asleep, and it was midnight. But they quickly picked up, and Brezhnev himself was woken up in the middle of the night. Once he was briefed on the situation, the premier ordered the entire Baltic fleet to mobilize and either stop Sablin or sink the Century. The Baltic fleet quickly caught up to the Century, and some began to attack, but as mentioned before, some were hesitant. They were confused and wondering why they were attacking a friendly ship. The KGB radioed the mutineers themselves and told them to surrender and give up Sablin, but the crew, like their captain, was defiant. They might have been able to succeed, but it just wasn't meant to be. A plane bombed the Century and knocked out the rudder, leaving them dead in the water. The mood immediately turned, and someone unknown set the captain free. He proceeded to make his way to the bridge where Sablin was and shot him in the leg. The KGB came in and quickly took control of the situation. Everyone was arrested, including Sablin and Shine. Shine got lucky, to say the least, but Sablin did not. Sablin was he was locked up for 9 months and ruthlessly interrogated by the KGB. And Brezhnev wanted to make a clear example of him because this had never happened before. A political officer, a commissar himself, inspiring a revolution was unheard of at the time and completely out of left field. Left. Funny pun. But yeah, Brezhnev very much wanted to make an example out of Sablin. So 9 months after the mutiny, after being ruthlessly tortured and interrogated along with the rest of the crew, a show trial was arranged and Sablin was sentenced to death by Leonid Brezhnev himself. On August 3rd, 1976, Sablin was shot. He was 37 years old at the time. His family was not told about his death until several years later. And that was the end of it, to say the least. The Kremlin initially reported the mutiny as an attempt to defect to the West, which wasn't completely out of the question in the minds of the Kremlin, because the route the Century was taking to Leningrad was going through a very specific path. And anyone could have looked at it and thought that Sablin was instead defecting and going to Sweden to NATO. But the way the land is laid out and the ocean is, it could have gone either way. But Sablin's plan was going to Leningrad, which is not, And the story went untold for several years by this point. His family did not know about his death until they actually inquired about it later. They asked, "Hey, where's our guy Sablin?" And they said, "Oh, he's dead. He's dead." And they sent him. And it was only because they inquired that they managed to get the information about his death and the mutiny in the first place. And yeah, the story was covered up. All of it was suppressed, untold for several years. But as mentioned before, Gregory D. Young was the first to do research on the mutiny, and he would later go on to write his master's thesis, and then co-wrote a book called The Last Century with another person, allowing Sablin's story to be told in full for the first time in the West as well. And of course, Sablin's story would reach Tom Clancy to write the book The Hunt for Red October, which would later be adapted into the film, where we know the altered story today. And of course, there's many differences between the story and the real events. In the story in Red October, for example, the captain, Mark Aurelius, Sean Connery's character, was the mutineer, not the political officer who, funnily enough, his last name was Putin in the film. I just found like a really funny tidbit. And yeah, generally speaking, that's where the story ends for the most part. Most people today found out about Sablin through either The Hunt for Red October, doing research for it, through reading The Last Century, or through a video game called through a video game mod called The New Order: The Last Days of Europe, which is a dark alternate history setting which features him as a character. That's even how I found out about him for the first time. So, what's the point? Why does this matter? Why are we even talking about this? The dude died like years and years ago. His mutiny failed. A lot of reasons. Firstly, his politics. Sablin was not just a blind follower of corrupt leaders of the Soviet Union. He was a true communist and a true revolutionary who saw what was wrong and wanted to change it. He was someone who looked at the system that was in place in the USSR, the corruption and stagnation that had been going on for years and years at this point, and he decided enough was enough, and he wanted to fight. He wanted to fight for a new revolution that would have brought about real change. Secondly, his absolute ballsiness, his defiance. Even with the odds massively against him, he fought to the very end because he believed in his vision and he believed in the people of the Soviet Union. He very well could have succeeded if he had made it to Leningrad. The speech itself is massive and very, very long, but it's full of revolutionary fervor and very, very optimistic and impressive. And finally, his optimism himself. Sablin was a deeply optimistic person, and he believed in the power of the people. His aim was not to put himself in power, but to urge the people themselves to revolt. He, as far as we know, he never made any plans to take control of this thing. He very much wanted a socialism from below revolution. Even the letter he was allowed to write to his son before he was executed was proof of his revolutionary optimism. Quote, "Trust the fact that history will judge events honestly, and you will never have to be ashamed for what your father did. On no account ever be one of those people who criticize but do not follow through their actions. Such people are hypocrites, weak, worthless people who do not have the power to reconcile their beliefs with their actions. I wish you courage, my dear." I can think of no other way to wrap this up than with this final quote, once again from Sablin's letter to his son. These are words that we as communists should carry in our heads and our hearts for as long as we continue the fight for a better world. Be strong in the belief that life is wonderful. Be positive and believe that the revolution will always win. So that's the end of my talk. That's all I got.